In Washington, D.C. And while the war in Ukraine has begun, the last 16 hours, last 18 hours actually, have been a scene of explosions, of invasions, of massive military movements, the likes of which we have not seen since the end of World War II in Europe. It's also been a busy day in Washington. The White House, President Biden scrambling to react. And just a few moments ago, perhaps about an hour ago, we did hear from President Biden announcing the so-called second tranche or the second section of sanctions that he had threatened and promised for weeks now if Vladimir Putin were to go through with his invasion of Ukraine. That invasion has in fact gone through. The timing, very interesting last night, about 10 o'clock here in the East Coast of the United States. A Security Council meeting at the United Nations, an emergency meeting, had just begun. No sooner had it begun and the delegates started talking and discussing what was about to happen in Ukraine than Vladimir Putin himself appeared on Russian television, a surprise announcement saying that the invasion had in effect begun. Very shortly thereafter, many of the people that we were talking to on NewsNation in Ukraine, both Americans and Ukrainians, started to hear explosions, started to see flashes of light in the sky. And shortly after that, we know now that Russian troops started pouring over the border from virtually all directions. Now they are coming from Belarus in the north, from Russia also in the north, from the south in the annexed territory of Russia's that legally and recognized under international law of Crimea still belongs to Ukraine, nevertheless now controlled by Russia for the last 8 years. Troops coming from there as well. We're also learning of amphibious assaults from Russian ships to the south in the Black Sea. So by all accounts, a full-on assault. We've heard from the Pentagon over the course of the morning here in Washington saying there is heavy fighting in the northern city of Kharkiv. It appears that the Russians in this staged assault are trying to demobilize or take out off the battlefield what the Ukrainian army has at airfields, what it has at depots, what it has at other places where they are staging to try to defend themselves. So the last 18 hours have been a chaotic and catastrophic event in Ukraine and in modern history, really, since World War II, as the West now struggles to respond with a series of harsh sanctions, severe sanctions, according to President Biden. They're essentially freezing the assets of many of the people close to Vladimir Putin, the so-called oligarchs. They are freezing the accounts of some of the biggest financial institutions in Russia as well. We already know that they have suspended the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline that comes from Russia to Germany that was about to be opened. And so in this way, President Biden and Western allies hope that they can not deter Vladimir Putin, because it's too late for that. They hope that they can punish Vladimir Putin and get him to stop what he's doing, withdraw from Ukraine. Whether or not Vladimir Putin is going to do so, very much an open question. And certainly everything we've heard from Vladimir Putin now has been utter defiance and even contempt of the West and its leaders, including President Biden. We have some questions now I want to go to. Marianne in Florida asks, where are U.S. troops in Europe? That's a great question. And we do have some breaking news actually here on this Thursday afternoon. We've just heard from the Pentagon, and that 7,000 more U.S. troops are going to be deployed, mostly we believe from areas already inside Western Europe, but certainly considerably to the west of the borders with Russia and Ukraine, will be redeployed into some of these NATO countries, American allies like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states that border Ukraine, and most significantly Russia. And that is the major concern here as we reach the second day of this conflict, of this war. What are the possible collateral effects? What are the spillover effects into Eastern Europe, into these countries like Poland, like Romania, that the U.S. is bound to defend as NATO allies, the so-called Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which compels the U.S. and other NATO allies to come to the defense of these countries and fight. President Biden has said that U.S. troops will not be in Ukraine. They will not face the Russian army as they advance through that country. That would be tantamount to World War III. But with everything that's going on, with the warfare that could spill over, with the cyber warfare that could spill over into many of these countries, creating a chaotic mess, creating a refugee flow, an estimate now we're hearing of some 5 million that could try to flee Ukraine into Western Europe. We've already seen the images of traffic jams, of people trying to make that trip. What is the possible collateral damage? What are the unanticipated effects of this invasion that could cause chaos in the region and cause it very ominously to spread? Let's go to Sue from St. Louis. She asked, why is Russia against NATO? It's sort of my bad habit to get into a little bit of quick history here, but just to explain, NATO was formed as a counterbalance to the Russian bloc, the so-called Soviet bloc of Russia. What was, Ukraine was a province of Russia. So were the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Poland was part of what was called the Warsaw Pact. So you had the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance on one side led by Russia, and you had the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which still exists, NATO, led by the United States and Western European countries. Remember that Germany at the time was partitioned. There was East Europe that was in the Warsaw Pact, and East Germany in the Warsaw Pact, and West Germany was in NATO. The Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore. NATO certainly does, and it has expanded into former Warsaw Pact nations like Poland, like Romania, like those Baltic countries that were also provinces or republics within the USSR. That is something that Vladimir Putin has very much railed against, seeking assurances over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union that NATO would not be expanding into those countries, right up to the doorstep of Russia. That is what his principal objection, at least ostensible stated objection is, as he has threatened and now gone through and followed through with those threats in invading Poland. He does not want NATO in Eastern Europe, and he certainly didn't want NATO to be part of Ukraine, although that was years from happening, if it was going to happen at all. Although Ukraine was turning towards Western Europe, that is part of what has provoked Vladimir Putin over the course of the last years, as he's incrementally taken control of parts of Ukraine and now is just invaded Ukraine and trying to decapitate the leadership there, bring it back into Russia's orbit, and turn it away from the West by force. And that is why you're seeing this dire struggle here that has geopolitical reverberations that are going to be felt around the world, that are already being felt around the world. T. McPherson from South Carolina, you have your question. What is Putin's ultimate goal? Well, I've already gotten into a little bit of this. He wants to turn back NATO. He wants to expand what was once the Soviet Empire. He wants to expand that sphere of influence. Remember, the Soviet Union not only included Ukraine and the Baltic states, Belarus, which is now ostensibly or so-called independent state, even though it's very much under Vladimir Putin's thumb at this point, with Russian troops marching all over the place and invading from Belarus into Ukraine. But it also included Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and many of the countries of Central Europe and near Far Eastern Europe that now border Afghanistan and other countries in that region. And so since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin, it is said, has ambitions to right what he believes is a wrong in the breakup of the Soviet Union, leaving only Russia and what's called the Russian Federation now. So, it's difficult to play armchair psychologist and get into Vladimir Putin's head, but these are things that he has said publicly. He's also been very disdainful, as we've heard, in what was largely regarded as a rambling, even disjointed speech earlier in the week, when he questioned the very right of Ukraine to exist, saying it was never really a country, it was always part of Russia. Obviously, 40 million Ukrainians in a country that's roughly the size of Texas disagree very strongly. Incidentally, we do know that there is heavy fighting, according to the Pentagon, in those northern regions of Ukraine, Kharkiv in particular, as I mentioned, the city there, as Russia tries to take out its airfields, tries to take out its military facilities, tries to take out Ukrainian weaponry, and evidently, we don't know for sure, but to move straight into Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Dana in Florida says, does Ukraine have nuclear weapons? If so, would they use them against Russia? Ukraine there used to be nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil when it was part of the Soviet Union. A 1994 deal, as part of the deal to grant Ukraine its independence and form the country of Ukraine, signed a deal with Russia, among other signatories, to give up the nuclear weapons that were on its territory. They essentially gave them back to Russia. So no, Ukraine does not have nuclear weapons at this point, although Russia has some 6,000 nuclear warheads deliverable on any number of platforms, be it intercontinental ballistic missiles or so-called battlefield tactical weapons. And that is something that's very much on the minds of a lot of people right now, simply because we do not know how far this escalates. And once you let this genie out of the bottle, once you unleash this sort of maelstrom on the world, where does it end? Nobody knows. Our fifth question here: what are the latest sanctions from Biden, and what will they achieve? Okay, so we've already gone through a little bit of what the sanctions that have been announced just today. Again, the second part of the sanctions, the second shoe to drop, if you will. President Biden saying that they're going to end up costing Russia dearly. And again, the threat of these sanctions were meant to be a deterrent. It hasn't worked as a deterrent. That's clear. Now, will it work as a punishment? And will they be painful enough to force Vladimir Putin to stop what he's doing and retreat? That very much an open question. And I think there's a lot of skepticism about whether that's actually going to happen. President Biden did not announce personal sanctions against Vladimir Putin, but he says that that is still on the table, and they're implying that there are even more steps that the U.S. and its allies could take against Russia that don't involve military action. He's also saying that every asset Russia has in America will be frozen, that the sanctions will ensure Russia cannot finance and grow its military. He says that he's making the announcement today. He met with the G7 leaders. It used to be called the G8, incidentally, until the Crimean invasion by Russia of the Crimean Peninsula and Ukraine, until the G8 threw out Vladimir Putin. Now it's back to being the G7. So one thing that was missing, you may hear this acronym a lot, it's called SWIFT. It's the International Financial System. It's essentially how banks and financial institutions worldwide talk to each other. This has been a flashpoint, a point of a lot of speculation, whether these sanctions would include kicking Russia out of SWIFT. They've stopped short of doing that. It's unclear why, although I think there are a lot of unintended consequences that many experts say that the governments are worried about if they were to take that step. Let's see. Logan in Iowa, what would it take for the U.S. to get involved in a combat situation? We're going to take President Biden at his word. He doesn't want to go into Ukraine with American troops to fight Russians. The American public, I would venture to guess, does not want to see that happen. So the larger danger is what are the spillover chances of a spillover into Eastern European countries that are allies by treaty with the United States. We've already talked a little bit about that. What is the unintended collateral damage of warfare between Ukraine and Russia? Could there be accidental forays, or intentional forays in order to provoke allies and engage a larger conflict? Whatever, we don't know what's in the heart of Vladimir Putin. We don't know what's in the mind of Vladimir Putin or his generals and how they plan to conduct this war. And at this point, I think U.S. planners are not taking anything off the table. Again, 7,000 more U.S. troops deployed to what I guess we could call the front line, not the front line against Russian troops, but the front line in those countries just to the west of Russia and Ukraine, to reassure those countries, number one, that the U.S. is there to help protect them if there is spillover, if there's that unintentional or intentional military collateral damage or forays into those countries. It's happened before. It's happened in Syria and Turkey. It happens by accident. It happens on purpose. It's a very, very volatile situation. Number 7, Daniel in D.C. Hey, I'm from D.C. Are there any countries that aren't sanctioning Russia that could support Putin? Are they a threat? I don't know precisely at this moment what China's stance is on sanctions. They are not sanctioning Russia as far as I know, notwithstanding the fact that every country from Japan all the way around the world to the United States and Canada are in fact imposing what they term severe sanctions on Vladimir Putin. China, obviously a key player here. And it really brings up the geopolitical questions about what is China up to? Is China watching this very closely? Let's not forget that China has an analogous situation with Taiwan, the country of Taiwan, which China now has always considered since 1947, since Mao marched into Beijing and the Red Army took over. They considered Taiwan to be a part of China. It's been independent. The Kuomintang, the Chinese who ran China up until 1947, retreated to Taiwan, where they and their descendants have ruled ever since. The point is that China, many people are looking at this. If Vladimir Putin is just going to brazenly enter an independent, sovereign country, regardless of how he feels about Ukrainian sovereignty, regardless of how he feels about Ukraine's right to exist, everybody else recognizes Ukraine's right to exist. China is going to be watching that very closely. What is the West's reaction? There's already been a lot of military activity and more bellicose behavior on the part of the Chinese military around Taiwan. So that's a very high stakes situation that everybody is going to be watching to see how the West reacts, what Putin's reaction is going to be. Vladimir Putin, for his part, we are 18 hours into this. So far, the Western alliance is four square behind these sanctions against Vladimir Putin, trying to punish Putin. How long will it last? How long will the unity last? They used to say, well, politics stops at the water's edge here in the United States whenever there was a conflict like that. From the moment this happened, there's been partisan criticism, or I should just say Republican criticism in some quarters of the way President Biden has behaved up until this point, and his evident failure to deter Vladimir Putin from taking this step. And so Vladimir Putin sees that. Anybody can see the divisions within American society, both politically and culturally, the rise of more authoritarian regimes around the world. And so this is an historic moment. It's a watershed moment for the world. The direction of this conflict, the resolution of this conflict, and how the West reacts, and whether the West can stay unified, what used to be called the free world, can stay unified in opposition to what's happened over the course of the last day. Let's see. We're going to put some fresh questions in the chat. Just hearing now, fresh questions in the chat. Okay, there we go. Tammy on Facebook. Tammy, I'm looking for you on Facebook. Asks, will we sanction China if they help Russia? Thank you to my assistant, Mike Ewing, in my ear. Don't know. Doubt it. There's a lot at stake here in the world economy. We haven't talked about the economic fallout of all this. You've probably heard about the price of gas. You've probably seen the price of gas already going up. Ukraine is also a big farm commodity producer, wheat and other agricultural products. It's all one big bowl. The world's oil, the world's agricultural commodities. You take a little bit out here, there's a reaction over here. There's a ripple effect, whatever you want to call it. And so the economic effect is something that President Biden was asked about today. He tried to be reassuring. They're trying to say that the United States is leading an effort to divert energy supply lines, supply chains, and compensate for the loss of Russian natural gas and Russian oil and coal that's going to result from the sanctions that have been imposed today. The reason I mention it is that, sanctioning China is, just an escalation, an economic escalation that may not be something that the administration wants to get involved in, because that would bring on even more economic hardship, economic devastation, more pain at the pump, more pocketbook issues, pain in the pocketbook for American consumers. And that is obviously something that President Biden or any American politician is going to want to avoid. So that seems very unlikely at this point. Okay, so where it stands right now, President Biden has announced the severe sanctions that he had long been threatening. Vladimir Putin's armies are on the march in Ukraine, presumably to march on the city of Kiev. The speculation is that they want to, quote unquote, decapitate the political leadership of Ukraine. It sounds like a grisly exercise, and it obviously is going to be. The Ukrainians say that they are engaging the Russians militarily. There's been heavy fighting in the northern parts of Ukraine. Ukrainians claiming to shoot down Russian aircraft and so forth. They say the first casualty of war is the truth. Take it all with a grain of salt. We don't know all of this firsthand. We're relying on the combatants to provide their version of what's actually happening here. So it's a very fluid situation. It's a very volatile situation. I think that's probably an understatement. And it's a very ominous moment, not only for the region, but for the world. We're going to be watching what the president has to say. Congress is out of session right now. They're on a President's Day recess this week. What they have to say when they return as well, whether or not they're going to support what the president does on a bipartisan basis. There's inevitably going to be criticism, but I think you're going to see an effort initially from Congress to try to come up with some kind of resolution, whether it's toothless or not, to express support at least for the Ukrainian people, if not for President Biden's policies exactly. So everything very much in the air, waiting to see if the sanctions bite on the U.S. side, on the allies' side, and on Vladimir Putin's side, waiting to see if the Western coalition that has imposed these sanctions can hang together, or whether he can have his way with Ukraine. I think that's going to wrap it up now, right, Mike? That's it, man. I've had fun. Yeah, I've yacked a lot, I heard. This is Mike Vaccaro, Bureau Chief for NewsNation in Washington, signing off.